Well, I hate to interrupt conversations, but it's time to begin. Let's start with the word of prayer and then we'll get into our class. Father in heaven, we come before your throne at this time and just thank you for another opportunity we have to come together and study your word. Pray to be with our sister Pam as she's sick this morning. Just pray that she heal quickly and might be able to be with us next time. But Father, we're also aware that there are others who are sick and struggling in whatever way or are traveling. So pray that just those that are away from us at this time might be able to rejoin us. Father, we love you and we thank you for your many blessings. In your son's name we pray. Amen. All right, let's open up to Genesis 25. That's where we're going to spend our time today. Now, in this chapter, the author of Genesis is continuing the story of one of the sons of Abraham that we've introduced, and his name is Isaac. And we know from his story that he took a bride named Rebekah. But part of what the author records concerning Isaac here in chapter 25 is the story of the birth of Isaac's two sons, one of which would function as a continued fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham that he would become the father of a great number of people. Now, this story concerning the birth of Isaac's two sons begins in verses 19 and 20 of this chapter. He says there, "Now these are the records of the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife." So we'll pause there. Now, in these two verses, the author of Genesis is recording a brief genealogy, is what I'm calling it, of Isaac. And he reminds his readers of who Isaac was and that he was the son of Abraham. He's 40 years old when he takes Rebekah as his wife. And as we see there, she's the daughter and sister of the individuals listed in the second part of this verse. So, with all that in mind, what is said here very briefly recalls what has been said up to this point in Genesis concerning Abraham's son Isaac. Following the death of Sarah, he takes a wife named Rebekah. Now, in addition to those things, what also brings the author of Genesis to this point is that in the opening verses of chapter 25, the author records the death of Abraham, verses 1 through 11, and then gives a list of Ishmael's descendants in verses 12 through 18 of this chapter. Now, with that in mind, in verse 21 of this chapter, the author continues laying the foundation for the story of Isaac's two sons. What does verse 21 tell us? What was Isaac doing? He was praying to the Lord for what reason? And what does it mean that she was barren? Could not have children. So, that's the substance of Isaac's prayers. She's barren, and yes, she can't have children. So, what does God do in response? What ends up happening? It's okay. Absolutely, and we're going to talk about that. No, you're not jumping ahead. You're moving us in the right direction. Um, but what's the text say? So what did God do in response? What they're right there in verse 21. What does the text say? Answered him, and she conceived. Now, so following his marriage to Rebekah, we find out Rebekah's barren. Isaac's in continual communication with God because she's unable to have children. But then Rebekah eventually conceives. Now, furthermore, context indicates that even though Rebecca or Isaac married Rebecca at the age of 40, it would be 10 years before the Lord allowed Rebecca to conceive and have children. And that's a point we're going to come back to a little bit later. So, going on then into verse 22, I'll just read it. It says, "But the children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is so, why then am I this way?' So she went to inquire of the Lord." So Rebecca's conceived, but according to this verse, what's going on inside her with these children? What are they doing? They're fighting. They are fighting with each other. Yeah, I'm sure it's a very uncomfortable situation. So what does she do when she has this going on inside her? She goes to God for help. She basically starts praying. So this concludes the introduction of the story of Rebecca and her children. These children inside her were in some way in some kind of conflict. And I've heard that happens when there's more than two children in the womb. So she asked God, the idea here is, God, if you've answered my prayer, why is this going on inside me? So it's these things that set the stage for the story that the author is going to tell concerning these children. Any questions or comments before we get into the story itself? Absolutely. It is good she went to God. So, with that in mind, what the author of Genesis will go on to do in verses 23 through 34 of this chapter is tell the story, I've used that terminology already, is tell the story of these two children that Rebecca was carrying. These were two boys that would receive the names of Jacob and Esau. Now, what the author also will reveal in this story is that from the womb, clear through birth, and the rest of their lives, these two boys would be in constant conflict with each other. Even though they were brothers, these individuals were brothers. Now, in other words, in telling this story about Rebekah's two children, what the author of Genesis does in verses 23 through 34 is among other things, he reveals three characteristics about these boys named Jacob and Esau, and we find more details about why they were in conflict with each other. First, we'll find from God's response to Rebekah is that these individuals were really two nations. It's what they would become. The second characteristic concerning these two boys is what we're beginning to establish. They were twin brothers. And finally, in verses 27 through 34, we'll find that they were enemies. Now, with that being the case, some application we'll take from these verses is that there will be times when even we'll be in opposition with our own brothers or sisters, and that sometimes manifests itself in the behaviors described in these verses. So, what the tale of Jacob and Esau really is a cautionary tale against ill treatment of our brothers and anyone else with whom we might share a relationship. So we'll listen to the story and then we'll look at the points. Again, that's Genesis 25, beginning in verse 27. When the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a peaceful man, living in tents. Now Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. When Jacob had cooked stew, Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, "Please let me have a swallow of that red stuff there, for I am famished." Therefore his name was called Edom. But Jacob said, "First sell me your birthright." Esau said, "Behold, I am about to die, so of what use then is the birthright to me?" And Jacob said, "First swear to me." So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank and rose and went on his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. So, the first characteristic that we find of Jacob and Esau is that they were two nations. So Rebekah's gone to God, "Why are these children struggling within me?" God answers there in verse 23. He says they were two nations and two peoples that would come from Rebekah's womb. Now, what does that mean, that they were two nations and two peoples, Jacob and Esau? He's talking about their... Absolutely. So, yes, these two individuals are going to have a long line of descendants behind them. So, with that in mind, the picture that's beginning to be drawn here is that these two children that would be born to Rebekah, they would separate from each other and would have descendants. Now, what is implied here as well is that there would be division between these two children and the nations and peoples they would give rise to. And we'll touch on that as well. So, since that's true, in the second two lines of this message from God, God says, one people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So this tells us something about the relationship between these two individuals. According to that statement, what's going to be their relationship? Okay. Yeah, right. So it is that picture. One's going to be more dominant, and then one's going to be in a position of servitude um, under the other. But more specifically, the text does say the older shall serve the younger. So this has the sense that the two people that are in Rebekah's womb, there will be one who will be stronger, and the older of the two will live in service to the younger. Now, since that's true, what we are seeing here is a prediction that Esau would ultimately be the one who lives into submission to Jacob. But when we read more of their story later on in the Old Testament, we find there are instances where Jacob would submit to Esau. But in the big picture, it's Esau that submits to Jacob. So, Jacob and Esau, their characteristic here is that they were two nations. God is revealing to Rebekah that the children in her womb would give rise to two nations, one of which would be stronger than the other, resulting in one submitting to the other. Now, we know this is true because there are numerous Old Testament passages within Genesis and other books of the Old Testament that show Esau and his descendants would be weaker than Jacob and his descendants, and submissive to Jacob and his descendants. Questions or comments on any of that? Okay, that's possible. That's definitely, there's a faith aspect to this. Anything else? Okay. So this brings us to verses 24 through 26, where we see that they were brothers as the emphasis here. So this point is introduced with the author of Genesis recording in verse 24 that at the point that Rebekah's days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Now, here we're just getting to the birth, or when she finds out there were twins, but the point of emphasis is on the fact that these individuals were twins. And we know that because of this word, behold. Now, can anyone tell me what the word behold means? When that word is used, what's it used for, in other words? No, it's not an easy question. Exactly. It's kind of look at this. You want to draw attention to something. We see this word a lot. So it says the days to be delivered were fulfilled. The 40 weeks or so have passed. But at some point, she finds out these are twins. But that's what the author is drawing attention to because of this word, behold. These are twins. That's what the author wants us to see. The children Rebekah was carrying were twins. So with that in mind, in verses 25 and 26, the author goes on to give a brief description of the delivery of these twins, as well as the age of Isaac when these twins were born. He was 60 years old. I have to correct my earlier statement. It was 20 years before these individuals were born. Now, what's Esau's description there? How does he come out? Red and hairy. We can spend all day imagining what that looks like, but he's red and hairy. Now, with that in mind, the physical description Esau given here has something to do with the name he received. Now, one reason we know this is because the name Esau is a name that's associated with the color red. Red's going to become a very significant thing in this story that we see. Now, another reason we know Esau's name was given to him because of his appearance, because his name, later in the context, as we've read, would be changed to Edom, because he would give up his birthright to Jacob to eat a red stew. And again, we'll come back to that. And so it's the redness of Esau that has something to do with why he received his name. So having given the description of the delivery of Esau in the first part of verse 26, the author goes on to record the description of Jacob's delivery. But any questions or comments on Esau before we get to Jacob? Yeah, that's important because Esau is the father, so to speak, of the Edomites. Yeah, they were very contentious, and that's started with Jacob and Esau. And we're going to see that here in the very next statement. So he gets on to Jacob's delivery. What's Jacob doing as Esau's coming out? He's holding on to his heel. Now, that little detail has something to do with why he receives his name, Jacob. Now, giving the description of Jacob's delivery, this carries with it the idea he was grasping the heel of Esau, and he receives that name. Now, as the grasping of the heel results in Jacob's receiving his name, the name Jacob literally means he grasps the heel, or he grabs the heel, we might say. Now, with that in mind, the idea of grasping the heel, it's an idea that is sometimes associated with either deception or protection. It could go either way. So since that's true, it's been said that the reason the author records this detail about Jacob's delivery is because he's pointing forward to how Jacob would deceive his brother and his father into receiving the birthright that otherwise belonged to Esau. Questions or comments on that before we get into the last part of verse 26? Absolutely. These boys were fighting with each other in the womb and beyond. So, yeah, so there is a lot of foreshadowing pointing forward to what's going to happen in the future. So, with that in mind, the last part of verse 26, the author concludes by recording Isaac's age at the time the boys were being born. He was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to Jacob and Esau. Now, from the context, by giving the age of Isaac and at which Jacob and Esau were born, what the author seems to be doing is giving a timestamp. He's showing how much time has passed before Rebekah had their two children. 20 years. Married when they're 40. Rebekah's barren. He's 60 when the children are born. There's where the faith aspect comes in. Isaac had been praying about this for at least that long. So by giving this timestamp, what the author seems to be doing as well is emphasizing the faith of Isaac, that the Lord would give them children. And he probably has in mind the promise to Abraham. But verses 1 through 11 of this chapter records his death. So he would have seen his grandchildren. So yeah. Absolutely. So Absolutely. So yeah, Abraham would have still been alive, and that probably would have helped Isaac's faith. But Sarah has died because Sarah's already dead when they got married. Um, so good point. Uh, Anything else on verse 26? So putting verses 24 through 26, the emphasis here is that Jacob and Esau were twin brothers. That's the children Rebekah were carrying, two twin boys. Now, even at their delivery, these twin brothers would be in conflict with each other. That, by evidence, by the fact that Jacob was grasping the heel of his brother Esau. Now, the author also shows that the names these brothers received had something to do with the way they were born. With these things being the case, we know that even though these brothers were twins, they were different in many different ways. They were polar opposites, we might say. So this brings us into verses 27 through 34 of this chapter. Now, in verse 27, the author of Genesis begins by giving the occupations of these individuals. Now, what did Esau become? And what else does the text say about him? A man of the field. And Jacob? What's his occupation, so to speak? Okay. You have cooking in your... Oh, well, yes, that's later. You're right. But here in verse 27, yeah, it says he's a peaceful man living in tents. But yes, he does go on to cook. Now, in recording these things, the author is establishing a context from this point through verse 34. Now, in other words, in recording the occupations of these individuals, he's continuing to show that Esau and Jacob lived very different lives. And that's something else that would contribute to the division that would exist between them. Now, furthermore, the author is also showing that they had a difference in character. Esau was a bit more of a wild man, we might say. Jacob lived in tents. He lived in more peaceful circumstances. So having recorded their occupations, in verse 28, the author goes on to record the relationship with their parents. It says, Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, what's being said there about the relationship with the parents? There was some favoritism, absolutely. Now, Isaac favored Esau. Rebekah favored Jacob. So, this carries with it the idea that Isaac had an affection of Esau as a result of Esau's taste for game, but Rebekah had an affection toward Jacob. Now, something else we should understand here is the author's not saying that Jacob and Esau were not loved by both their parents. Rather, he's simply saying that one had a greater, or that Isaac had a greater affection for Esau, and Rebekah a greater affection for Jacob. Now, one reason we know that is because the word loved here, it's the love of affection. When you feel affection towards someone, in other words. So, also from the context, one possible reason that the other parents, that the author presents this information is because he's emphasizing the division that would exist between Jacob and Esau. I moved through that pretty quick. Questions or comments up to this point before we get into verses 29 through 34? Okay. So, with all that being true, in verses 29 through 34, the author of Genesis goes on to record an incident that occurred between Esau and Jacob, and this incident would end up costing Esau his birthright. So, verse 29 sets the scene. Jacob had cooked stew. Esau came in from the field, and he was famished, is what the New American Standard says. Now, when you're famished, what does that mean? You're more than just hungry, okay? Explain that a little bit, Elaine. Exactly. He's more than starving. The Hebrew word for famished here comes from a word that has the idea of exhaustion and is typically associated with hunger and or thirst. And so the scenario here is one where Jacob, he's prepared a meal. Esau comes back from his hunting adventure, and he's ready to eat. That's all he wants because he's that tired, he's that hungry. So, what does Esau do in verse 30? What does he say? He asks him for some of the stew. Calls it red stuff. Now, with that in mind, as we come to this verse, the first thing we should understand is that presenting the information we read here, the point the author seems to be making is that Esau's name would change from Esau to Edom because he requested that Jacob give him a swallow of the stew, which the text says was red in color. We're back to this red concept. Now, if you have a footnote in your Bible, you'll notice that the name Edom, like Esau, comes from a word that means red. Since that's true, what is continuing to be emphasized here is that the redness is the redness of Esau, his appearance, and in the fact that what he wanted from Jacob was something that was red in color. So Esau's name becomes Edom. He would be the father of the people called the Edomites in the Old Testament. That's already been mentioned. Questions or comments on verse 30? All right. So, Esau's requested some of the red stuff. How does Jacob respond in verse 31? Sell me your birthright. So this refers to the fact that he's saying to him, Esau, if you want some of this stuff, sell me your birthright. Now, with that in mind, what Jacob is requiring of Esau, this birthright would be everything that belonged to Esau as the oldest son. Now there were twin brothers, but by virtue of the fact that Esau came out first, he would be considered the oldest, born ahead of Jacob. But what the text does not tell us is what this birthright consisted of. So all we can assume is that this is something Jacob considered valuable enough that he told Esau, sell it to me if you want some of this red stew. So in verse 32, how does Esau respond? Exactly. It is drastic. He tells Jacob, fine, I'm about to die. My birthright has no value to me. So he's agreeing. He's agreeing to the condition. I want this red stew. So how does Jacob respond? In verse 33, what else does he say? He wants him to seal the deal. He says, swear to me. Swear to me this is something you're going to do. Now, when somebody requires you to swear to something, what does that mean? To take an oath. That's what Jacob is telling Esau to do. Make an oath. Make this commitment that you're going to sell me your birthright. Now, what the text does not tell us, again, however, is how Esau sold his birthright to Jacob. We don't know. All we know from the text is that Jacob succeeded in getting Esau to sell his birthright to Jacob, all in exchange for a bowl of stew. So, the result, verse 34, the author closes this section by recording that Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew. Esau ate and drank and rose and went on his way. And the text says he despised his birthright. Now, what does it mean to despise something? He didn't give it value. That's exactly what it means. He didn't see any value in his birthright. He's already said that. What use is my birthright to me? I'm about to die. So he was willing to give it up for nothing more than just a taste of the meal his brother had prepared. Now, some application in that for us is Esau gave up a whole lot for a bowl of soup. Now, in a spiritual sense, we can apply that to say we might give up everything we have in our relationship with Christ for one instance of gratification. That's what Esau is doing. He had a whole lot ahead of him in this birthright, whatever it was, but he gave it all up for a bowl of soup. So, but what all these things tell us as far as Jacob and Esau are concerned is that they were enemies. The author of Genesis has shown that Jacob and Esau were opposed to one another in a variety of ways. They were opposed in their relationship with their parents. Another way they were opposed is in their manipulation of each other. That's what Jacob has done, is manipulated him. So this opposition would continue to be seen not only between themselves, Jacob and Esau themselves, but between their descendants. The Israelites being the descendants of Jacob, and the Edomites being the descendants of Esau. But the Israelites would always be the stronger of the two. Questions or comments on that before we wrap it up? Yeah. Yeah, we see that. So, yeah. And again, the substance of the birthright is not described. It was just something valuable. Anything else? True. Yeah, it is. Anything else? Okay. So just summing it up, Jacob and Esau were two nations. They were twin brothers. They were enemies. So with these things being true, is that there will sometimes be opposition that come from our own brethren. Now, among other things, the story of Jacob and Esau is a story that shows division can exist between siblings. So it's one that gives us a negative example of behaviors that can come about as a result of that division. So, the story of Jacob and Esau is a cautionary tale that warns us against these kinds of behaviors of being manipulative of one another. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, that's true. Anything else? All right. Don, will you close us in prayer today?